Hi all, welcome back. In this module and the next one, we're taking a close look at facilitation. So we start in this module by generally defining what we mean by facilitation, describing what facilitators do, and learning some key communication strategies to be good facilitators, listening and asking powerful questions. So in the next module, we'll focus more on how to deal with challenging situations as a facilitator. But for now, let's get the basics down. So the basic definition of facilitate is to make easier, right? That is generally the overall goal of facilitators. When conversations are stuck in negative patterns or too scary or difficult to even start in the first place, then facilitators can help make those conversations easier. A more complete definition of facilitation comes from communication scholar Larry Fry, who describes communication as what he calls the lifeblood of groups. So he says, group communication facilitation involves using meeting procedures to make it easier for groups to interact and exchange messages for the purposes of creating and sharing meaning. By structuring group communication in particular ways, facilitation unclogs blocked arteries and creates new veins for communication to flow smoothly among members. So it's a bit of a funny metaphor, I guess, with the lifeblood. But the idea is that facilitators are using procedures in groups to help make new communication possible and to help make hard things easier for groups. So what does it mean to be a facilitator? What should facilitators be like? We have some readings on this in this module, and so you'll get a sense for that. But just a general idea, it's really important that facilitators are neutral in terms of the topic. They're, some people would say unbiased. Others might say, well, you can never be completely unbiased, but you should at least be fair and neutral. You should be outside of the group. So you're not a member of a group who has a stake in the conversation. Usually a facilitator is somebody on the outside. Now that looks a little bit different if you're trying to facilitate difficult conversations in your family or your friendship group or something like that. But even then, you're taking on a facilitator role. So you're trying to make sure everybody is heard and trying to make sure the topic is really dug into in a way that's helpful and that communication kind of flows smoothly among the folks who are there. And so that means removing yourself from the argument a bit, right? Being on the outside. It's just being in a specific role. Facilitators are also really knowledgeable about design, right? So they need to be kind of well organized and be kind of flexible to the needs of the group, being able to know what kinds of designs are possible and then trying to adjust as needed. Facilitators need to be good communicators. You need to be good at, sort of verbal, spoken, and written, and then nonverbal communication, both in expressing yourself clearly and noticing the communication of others. You need to be good listeners and observers, good at relating to people, so empathic. And also you need to be brave, right? So there need to be not afraid to, in your role, interrupt bad patterns, call things out to say, this isn't what we agreed to, or I don't, the way I heard that might not be what you meant to say. Let me just double check in, or let me stop you here, right? All kinds of stuff like that facilitators need to be able to intervene, redirect, and gently confront as needed. So there's characteristics of your role, and then communication skills and sort of habits, and this sense, I think of it as sort of being assertive or being brave enough to step into that space and say, let me stop you here for a moment and let's go back and take a look at what just happened, right? So in the context of facilitating dialogue or deliberation about a difficult topic, facilitators have some important jobs. At first, the facilitator is in charge of the design, right? So facilitators kind of plan, guide, and manage the group interaction to help the group meet its goals. So group guidelines are really important, as we talked about in our last video. We spend time on these at the beginning and then get agreement and then refer back to them as needed, sort of helping the group say, yeah, this is what we're trying to do. Don't just sort of plunk them in there and just assume everybody agrees with them. It has to be like a process, like a living document, right, that you engage with. Use design, right, as we've talked about. Being mindful of time. Facilitators are often the ones who have to pay attention to, have we spent too much time on this? Is everybody getting a chance to speak, right? This sort of thing. And then asking good questions that really generate conversation, monitoring and managing speaking turns and taking notes, working with a co-facilitator to take notes if the group has, if you need to do that so that you have a record of the session, of what happened. Not all sessions need that, but a lot of times, especially if you're working for like a deliberation process where you're trying to take information and move with it or move toward a decision, then somebody needs to keep a record of what's going on. So yeah, the facilitator guides the process, guides the interaction to meet its goals. The facilitator also, along with that, is kind of responsible for being the keeper of the group, right? The keeper of the process. So ensuring that fairness, inclusion, respect, and other norms that are consistent with dialogue and deliberation are being lived out in the group, right? And the facilitator understands the design of the event and helps the group follow that design toward those sort of ends. Facilitator also needs to be mindful of the space, and this is part of the design, but in a dialogue group, it means especially thinking about how many people do you want talking to each other at a time, for example. Like some designs, really you want small groups, like 3 people at a table, and then that they switch around or something like this, like a World Cafe. Other times groups might want to self-organize, right, depending on the topic. But there's is your space going to be available for the kind of things that you want? Also, are there objects there that are helpful for you to have? Like sometimes they'll put paper on the table with markers and pens, sticky notes or stickers, something like this. And then also, of course, like snacks or toys or whatever like that to make it more fun if that's a kind of thing that's consistent with your goals. Often people are sitting in a circle or around small round tables to kind of flatten out hierarchies a little bit. Sometimes there are assigned seats at first, especially if you're trying to break up particular groups of people or break down some of the sort of status differences in a group. And then thinking about, mindfulness of the space and nonverbals for yourself as a facilitator. Are you going to be standing up, sitting down, walking around? Where are you going to be, right? And facilitators are also, of course, have to be building relationships with the participants in a way that's genuine and also transparent and fair, right? So building trust and rapport, doing active listening, highlighting points of connection that people share, and also highlighting points of difference that are relevant to the group. And it's really important you do this in a non-judgmental way. It can be like, oh, this is a really different perspective than was just shared over there. Isn't that really, it's important that we have these different perspectives. That's good to know, right? It helps us learn from one another. Sometimes people will be like, oh, well, we're all the same, right? But highlighting that these differences are there, but doing it in a way that's not like, oh, this one is good and that one is bad, right? And paying attention to time. Doing things like paraphrasing, summarizing, giving breaks if needed, but don't be so focused on the clock that you're insensitive to people's stories, but having the big picture sense of like, okay, we have about this much time for this activity, and then we're going to have to move on to something else so that you can be mindful of time there. So as you can tell, facilitators need to be really good listeners and need to understand how to pay attention to what people are doing in the group. So developing facilitation skills means not only learning about group dynamics and different designs for dialogue and deliberation, it also means building good communication skills and explaining tasks, asking good questions, and listening closely to the group. So our readings in this module give you some suggestions on how to develop those skills, and I encourage you to practice those on your own as you think about how you could facilitate difficult conversations. In our next module, we'll look more closely at how facilitators do their work, especially how they observe group behavior, interpret what it means, and decide whether and how to intervene. For now, I hope the learning materials are helpful and meaningful for you, and I look forward to seeing your reflections.